Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you an exercise that I think would be really useful for any beginners that really want to get into abstract or semi-abstract landscape painting. This method can be a really good way of loosening up and freeing yourself from any sort of preconceptions and ideas. And it's just using one colour. The best thing to do is to use a fairly dark colour for an exercise like this. I'm using Davidson's Grey, or you could use Paynes Grey, burnt umber, sepia, indigo, purple, whatever your colour of choice is. But a nice dark colour will give you a good strong starting point. So I've set my board at an angle of about somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees. My paper is Millford cold press paper. It's got a nice texture and it's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape. And the angle of the board is important because as I paint wet into wet, that's wet paint onto the wet page, my paint will flow and gravity will help me with the painting and help to give me that lovely abstract fresh quality to this exercise. You can of course use any size paper that you choose to, that you're comfortable with working on. I'm using quarter imperial. The dimensions will be below in the description. So the first thing to do is to mix up a generous puddle of paint in your colour, nice and richly pigmented, almost straight from the tube or wet up from the pan, into a nice rich mixture. And I'm going to be using a Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush, which is a flat brush that can create a very nice chiselled edge. It's really versatile, I'd say almost indispensable for this style of landscape painting. And I'm using a large enamel roasting tray as a palette, or you could use a large plate, just a big mixing surface, so you can mix up lots and lots of your colour, of your grey, and then you won't run out of paint halfway through the abstract. So let's get started, and working quite quickly and using another large brush just to wet the paper very quickly all over. So the larger brush the better, means you'll really be able to quickly get water onto your paper. I've thoroughly soaked 2/3 of the page, which will be my sky, and I have hit and miss and left some dry patches on my paper where my land is going to be. The dry patches will resist the paint and the water as it flows down the page and help to create that really fresh abstract texture that I'm looking for. Now this is my really rich paint. You can see I use the tips of my Harkey brush, the chisel edge, to dab the paint across the sort of horizon line, the join between the sky and the land. And I hope you can see the paint running down where the page is wet and resisting and going around the dry patches. And that's going to be particularly effective in the little join between the sky and land where it's bright white. And so now moving on to the foreground, large foreground sweep in a shallow diagonal from right to the bottom left corner, hopefully will start off the foreground and some of the midground. You can see that I've been dabbing in thicker, richer, darker paint, drier paint, so that it's sticking on those areas on the horizon that I've decided are going to be my abstract trees. So this is a more watery mixture of my Davidson's Grey, and I'm pulling it across the sky, allowing the paint to run out and become more diluted the further down towards the horizon I get. I'm working around my trees, making sure that the sky paint doesn't run into and disturb the trees too much. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a plastic store card. It's the flexible type with rounded corners, and I'm going to run that in the opposite direction to the diagonal that I put across with the Harkey brush. Another shallow diagonal from the horizon line across to the bottom right corner, and you can see that the corner of the card has swept and pulled away the paint and given me these interesting lighter marks across my page. And if any paint is running up or pooling across the painting in any places, use a damp brush, get all the moisture out of it, and just run that across the area where the paint is pooling up, and it will just mop up any spills. There's a couple just there, so I'm softening back around the trees. You can see what it's doing because the brush is almost dry. I'm not getting any nasty marks or runbacks. It's softening and lightening up very slightly and giving me a subtle cloud effect. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that if you try something like this at any stage, if you really like the look of your abstract landscape, step away and leave it to dry, because that's the thing about this. It can be very personal, whether you want a sparse, rugged, sort of very bleak, simple landscape, or whether you want to go a little bit further, maybe introduce slightly more realism to it by adding some tree trunks. But if you don't want to, if you like it just as it is, then that's the point at which to stop. And that way you begin to learn how not to overwork a painting, because we can overpaint these sorts of abstracts very, very easily. So less is more. Step away if you like it like this. For the purpose of the demonstration, though, I'll go a little bit further and show you a nice easy way to create your abstract suggested loose trees. Again, using the corner of the store card, I'm scraping through the wet paint, and it's giving me some lovely marks in the shapes of tree trunks and branches. I'm linking those blobs of paint so that they end up looking like tree canopies. That's the idea. So I'm linking the land to those blobs to create my branches and tree trunks. And of course, if you don't want to etch those, you can wait till it's completely dry, and then you can paint in the same sort of marks with a rigger brush or a small detail brush. And just before it dries, I want to drop in a few more darks into the damp painting. And it's important to say, don't apply anything more watery than the dampness of your paper. So you want a fairly dry, rich mix of paint. If you've got a wetter mix of paint, you'll end up with strange marks, cauliflowers and runbacks. And you want to avoid that if you can. So I'm going to put in shadows under the trees. I'm going to dot in a few more canopies, little marks that will create those tree canopies, maybe link up underneath those two little groups of trees that I've created, and then put some darker, richer paint into the painting across the midground. Running it along that diagonal and then bringing more of those dark marks up across the painting in that sort of following that first diagonal sweep of the Harkey brush. These will soften and diffuse, but they suggest foreground sort of hedges or grasses, something in nothing really. And then finally, I'm going to take the corner of the card again, and I'm going to pull it across the front, the lower edge of the tape, so that I bring some gently curving grasses across the very front of the foreground, most of the way along, but this will act to sort of work in tandem with the marks, the slightly diagonal marks that I've just put in with the darker paint, to lead the eye through the landscape or the semi-abstract landscape towards those distant trees. And now I'm just about finished. I'm going to lay my painting flat, and this is ordinary table salt. I'm putting a sprinkle of it across the foreground just before the foreground dries. It's still damp, and hopefully the salt will repel the damp paint and give me a few little nice sort of suggestions of abstract flowers. If you look closer, the salt has been on for a few minutes. I think you can just about see it's beginning to create these really subtle, pretty little patterns. So I'm going to leave it to dry completely and then come back and have a look at our semi-abstract and see how it's looking. So it's now completely dry, and I'm just going to finish it off. I think I'm going to put a few suggestions of tree canopies onto those distant trees using again my Harky brush and a sort of fairly weak mixture, because I don't want them to be too strong, a weak mixture of my Davidson's Grey or Paynes Grey, and using the corner of the brush and the belly of the brush to just carefully scrape or touch on the paint very lightly across the grain of the paper. You can see it's giving me this sort of hit and miss, almost a stippled effect of just a few leaves over some of those branches. And it's at this point you can paint in your branches and trunks if you decided not to edge them in with the card. Now brushing off the salt completely with a dry brush, and we are just about finished. So I'm going to remove the tape now and pull your tape away from the painting just in case it was to catch the painting, and if it was to tear, if you're pulling the tape away from the painting, you won't tear into it. When we reveal a clean white border like this, it gives us a chance to look at the painting sort of with fresh eyes. We can decide whether it needs anything done to it. But I think as a nice simple exercise, just using one colour, I think this works quite well, and I think for beginners this is an ideal exercise if you're trying to find your way into abstract landscape painting, just to play around and experiment and try out different effects, but using just the one colour to get all your tones, and using brushes and maybe a card to etch some marks, that sort of thing, and then adding some salt for these really pretty effects, and playing around and seeing what the paint and the water will do for you. I think this is a good way of getting into abstract landscape painting, and you can get some surprisingly effective results using this sort of method with a bit of practice. And I forgot to mention, it's quite important with this method to try and leave some of those patches of dry paper. I think you can see how effective those patches are, where we can see the white behind that tree line. It really does help to make that focal tree line pop. And the more you practice this kind of method, the more you'll find your own ways, your own solutions, and your own effects that you decide that you really, really like and want to pursue. And before you know it, you'll be painting the most amazing, unique, and beautiful abstract or semi-abstract landscapes. Do let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know how you get on. And thank you so much for watching. And thanks to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. There is an abstract watercolour painting series on Patreon, an exclusive series that I'm working on. There are quite a few episodes there already, and every few weeks we add more. So if this sort of thing interests you, then please follow the link below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon, and happy abstract painting. Bye.